A long-forgotten Chevrolet Caprice idled in the distance, its blue paint faded by years of Ohio winters, parked just far enough away to avoid notice. Through its windshield, a pair of binoculars tracked the procession of white dresses and black tuxedos emerging from St. Mary's Catholic Church in Columbus. It was June 14, 1984, and Catherine Miller had just become Catherine Reynolds. She smiled radiantly, unaware of the eyes watching her every movement, cataloguing the details of her dress, her hair, her jewelry, her happiness. The observer remained in his vehicle, patient and methodical, as he had been with the previous brides. The wedding party drove away in decorated cars toward their reception, and only then did the Caprice's engine quietly hum to life, following at a careful distance. Ohio, in the mid-1980s, existed in a particular moment of American transition. The recession of the early decade was beginning to ease, but Rust Belt cities like Columbus, Cincinnati, and Cleveland still bore the economic scars of industrial decline. Wedding announcements in local papers offered brief respites of joy amid news of factory closures and international tensions. The ritual of matrimony remained a constant, a sacred tradition that communities celebrated with elaborate ceremonies in historic churches and receptions in century-old halls and newly built hotel ballrooms. These gatherings typically wound down in the late evening, with newlyweds departing for honeymoon suites or modest motel accommodations before embarking on their new lives together. The Columbus of 1984 was a city in transition. The downtown area had begun to see revitalization efforts after years of suburban flight, with historic buildings being repurposed into upscale hotels catering to business travelers and special occasions. The Marriott, housed in a renovated bank building from the 1920s, had become particularly popular for wedding receptions, its grand ballroom a reminder of more prosperous times. The city's economy still relied heavily on government employment and Ohio State University, providing stability even as manufacturing declined throughout the region. Wedding announcements in the Columbus Dispatch had become more elaborate during this period, often featuring detailed descriptions of ceremonies and receptions, complete with photographs of brides in their wedding finery, public declarations of happiness that inadvertently created a catalogue of potential victims. For 4 young brides between 1984 and 1986, these traditional celebrations became preludes to inexplicable tragedy. Each disappeared from their wedding night accommodations, leaving behind confused grooms who awakened alone. The first was Rebecca Taylor, aged 24, who vanished from the Marriott in downtown Columbus on August 18, 1984. Her new husband, Michael Taylor, reported awakening around 2 a.m. to find her missing. The room showed no signs of struggle, and her purse and identification remained, though her wedding band had seemingly been removed. Local police initially suspected cold feet or a peculiar marital dispute. It would take 2 more similar cases before investigators began connecting the disappearances. Rebecca and Michael Taylor had met as students at Ohio State University 3 years earlier, their courtship progressing through the traditional milestones of engagement and wedding planning. Their ceremony at First Presbyterian Church had been featured prominently in the Dispatch's weekend edition, with a photograph capturing Rebecca's radiant smile beneath a cathedral-length veil. The reception at the Marriott had continued until nearly midnight, with guests reporting nothing unusual about the couple's departure to their honeymoon suite on the hotel's top floor. Michael's statement to police described a perfect day, followed by an incomprehensible morning. Awakening to find the other side of the bed empty, Rebecca's wedding gown carefully hung in the closet, her overnight bag unpacked, but no sign of his bride of less than 24 hours. The second bride, Lisa Connor, disappeared from the Renaissance Hotel in Cleveland on May 11, 1985. Her husband, Thomas, reported circumstances nearly identical to the Taylor case. He woke alone, her belongings untouched except for the missing wedding ring. The third, Catherine Reynolds, vanished on June 14, 1985, from the Cincinnati Hilton, precisely the same pattern emerging. By this point, Detective James Harrington of the Ohio State Highway Patrol noticed the pattern and began coordinating with local departments across the 3 cities. Initially, his concerns were met with skepticism. The distances between incidents and the lack of evidence made connections seem tenuous at best. Detective Harrington, a 15-year veteran of the Highway Patrol, had developed a reputation for recognizing patterns across jurisdictional boundaries. His position gave him a unique perspective, routinely traversing the state's major cities and maintaining contacts with local departments. When he first noted the similarities between the Taylor and Connor cases, he created a manual cross-reference system, requesting case files from both Columbus and Cleveland police departments. The addition of the Reynolds case strengthened his suspicion of a connection, particularly given the consistent detail of the missing wedding rings. Harrington began traveling to each city on his days off, conducting interviews and reviewing evidence outside his official duties, his persistence eventually convincing supervisors to establish a formal task force. The Chevrolet Caprice, manufactured between 1977 and 1984, became a common sight on Ohio highways during this period. The vehicle's spacious interior and reliable V8 engine made it popular among both civilian drivers and law enforcement. The Ohio State Highway Patrol maintained a fleet of these vehicles, typically in dark colors, with distinctive light bars. This familiarity allowed certain models to blend seamlessly into the background of roadways and parking lots, practically invisible in their ubiquity. Such was the case with the faded blue Caprice that appeared in security footage recovered from hotel parking garages, always distant, always partially obscured, but increasingly present as Detective Harrington reviewed archived surveillance from each incident. The 1982 Chevrolet Caprice represented the final iteration of the third-generation model, featuring squared-off styling and improved fuel efficiency compared to its predecessors. With a 305 cubic inch V8 engine providing reliable power and a cavernous trunk designed for family travel, the model had become particularly popular in the Midwest, where its robust heating system and reliable performance suited the region's harsh winters and varied terrain. Law enforcement agencies throughout Ohio had adopted the Caprice as their standard patrol vehicle, appreciating its combination of performance, durability, and imposing presence. The Ohio State Highway Patrol's fleet featured the distinctive color scheme of deep blue with silver accents, while local police departments typically employed black or dark blue models. This ubiquity created a psychological association between the vehicle and authority figures, a connection that would later prove significant in understanding how the perpetrator gained access to secured areas without raising suspicion. When the fourth bride, Jennifer Morris, disappeared from the Renaissance Cincinnati on October 5, 1986, the pattern became impossible to ignore. The wedding night vanishings, as newspapers had begun calling them, created a wave of anxiety across Ohio. Wedding venues increased security, hotels implemented buddy systems for newlywed couples, and the state police established a dedicated task force. Detective Harrington obsessively reviewed the limited evidence, focusing on the consistent elements: upscale hotels, summer or fall weddings, and brides who had placed wedding announcements with photographs in local papers weeks before their ceremonies. The task force, officially designated Operation Bridal Suite, established headquarters in a conference room at the Ohio State Highway Patrol's Columbus Division. The walls quickly filled with photographs, timelines, and maps connecting the four disappearances. Detective Harrington employed a color-coded system: red for confirmed evidence, yellow for probable connections, and blue for theoretical links. This visual organization allowed the team to identify investigative gaps and prioritize leads. Most promising was the emerging vehicle connection. Security footage from each hotel parking area showed a dark-colored Caprice present during the relevant timeframes, though always parked at angles that obscured license plates. The task force expanded to include forensic analysts, behavioral specialists, and detectives from each affected city, with daily briefings coordinated by Harrington, whose methodical approach kept the investigation focused despite increasing public pressure for results. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A night clerk at the Renaissance Cincinnati, Martin Wheeler, recognized something unusual in the security footage from the night of Jennifer Morris's disappearance. A man in what appeared to be hotel maintenance coveralls had accessed the service elevator shortly after midnight. Wheeler, having worked the maintenance department himself years earlier, noted that the uniform was outdated. The Renaissance had changed their staff uniforms 3 months prior. This observation led investigators to review staffing records across all 4 hotels, revealing no maintenance personnel scheduled during the hours in question. Wheeler's attention to detail stemmed from his 5 years of experience in hotel operations. Having worked his way from maintenance to front desk positions, he maintained friendships with staff across departments and took pride in knowing operational details that others might overlook. The uniform was wrong, he later testified. The Renaissance had switched from navy blue to grey coveralls that summer, and the shoulder patch had been redesigned. What I saw on the tape was the old style, something no current employee would be wearing. This observation prompted investigators to review security footage with greater scrutiny, focusing specifically on service areas and employee-only sections of each hotel. The resulting compilation revealed a pattern of security breaches preceding each disappearance, always involving a similarly dressed figure, accessing restricted areas through service entrances or employee corridors. Enhanced analysis of the security footage revealed a consistent physical description. Male, approximately 5'10", average build, always wearing some form of service uniform or janitorial coveralls that provided both disguise and credibility within hotel environments. The suspect's methodical approach suggested extensive planning and surveillance. Wedding announcements published in newspapers, with their detailed information about venues and dates, provided an easily accessible source of potential victims. The pattern emerged. The perpetrator selected his targets from these announcements, observed their weddings, followed the couples to their hotels, and somehow gained access to their rooms in the early morning hours. Forensic technician Sophia Ramirez, assigned to the task force from the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation, developed enhanced imaging techniques to extract maximum detail from the grainy security footage. By combining frames from multiple camera angles and applying early digital enhancement methods, she gradually constructed a more detailed profile of the suspect. The coveralls weren't just a disguise, she noted in her analysis. They were a tool of psychological manipulation. Hotel guests and even staff instinctively defer to maintenance workers, assuming they have legitimate reasons to access any area. Most people actively avoid eye contact with service personnel, which explains why witnesses had such difficulty providing consistent descriptions. This insight shifted the investigation's focus toward individuals with knowledge of hotel operations and security protocols, particularly those who might have worked across multiple properties. The vehicle connection strengthened when forensic teams identified partial tire impressions in the landscaping outside a service entrance at the Cincinnati Hilton. The tread pattern matched Firestone tires commonly used on mid-1980s Chevrolet models. A more thorough review of parking garage footage from the Cleveland and Cincinnati locations confirmed the presence of a blue Caprice in the vicinity during each incident. The vehicle's license plate remained obscured in all footage, but distinctive rust patterns on the rear quarter panel provided a unique identifier. Tire expert Raymond Bowman from the Highway Patrol's Forensic Division identified the impressions as coming from Firestone FR721 radials, a common factory-installed tire on 1981-1983 Chevrolet models. The distinctive wear pattern suggested frequent highway driving, consistent with someone traveling regularly between Ohio's major cities. The partial impressions had captured a unique manufacturing defect in the tread, a slight misalignment that created a recognizable pattern. If we locate the vehicle, Bowman reported, we can match these tires with absolute certainty. This defect is essentially a fingerprint. Meanwhile, automotive specialist Teresa Mendoza focused on the distinctive rust pattern visible in the enhanced security footage, determining that it resulted from a collision repair using non-factory techniques, creating another unique identifier to narrow the search. By early 1987, the task force had compiled a profile of their suspect, likely a middle-aged male with knowledge of hotel security systems, possibly with a background in maintenance or security work, and harboring a specific fixation on brides. The wedding rings appeared to be the only items taken from each scene, suggesting a ritualistic component to the crimes. The methodical nature of the abductions, leaving no witnesses and minimal evidence, indicated careful planning and precise execution. Most disturbingly, the increased time between the third and fourth abductions suggested the perpetrator might be holding or maintaining his victims for extended periods. FBI behavioral analyst Dr. Lawrence Peterson, consulted by the task force, provided crucial insights into the psychological aspects of the case. What we're seeing is ritualistic behavior with strong elements of objectification and possession. he explained. The consistent removal of wedding rings suggests a symbolic rejection of the marriage covenant. Perhaps the perpetrator views himself as rescuing these women from relationships he perceives as unworthy. The increasing time between abductions indicates he may be keeping victims for longer periods, possibly in a controlled environment where he can maintain his fantasy. This analysis prompted investigators to expand their search parameters to include properties suited for long-term captivity, focusing on remote locations with privacy yet reasonable proximity to major highways connecting Ohio's urban centers. This hypothesis proved tragically accurate on April 16, 1987, when hikers discovered human remains in a remote area of Hocking Hills State Park, approximately 50 miles southeast of Columbus. Dental records confirmed the remains belonged to Rebecca Taylor, the first bride to disappear. Forensic analysis indicated she had survived for several months after her abduction. The discovery sent shockwaves through the investigation team and the public alike. The mysterious disappearances were now confirmed homicides, and the urgency to identify and apprehend the perpetrator intensified dramatically. The hikers, Jonathan and Melissa Archer, had ventured off the marked trail in search of a waterfall mentioned in a local guidebook when they discovered partially concealed human remains beneath a rock outcropping. Their immediate call to park rangers initiated a careful recovery operation, overseen by forensic anthropologist Dr. Eleanor Wilson from Ohio State University. The remains were not simply discarded, Dr. Wilson noted in her preliminary report. They had been carefully positioned and partially wrapped in preserved wedding veil material. There was evidence of long-term care before death. The body showed no signs of malnutrition or physical abuse. This was not a typical murder victim, but someone who had been maintained alive for an extended period under controlled conditions. This assessment aligned with Dr. Peterson's earlier profile and suggested a level of medical knowledge that added a new dimension to the investigation. 2 weeks later, a second set of remains was discovered in the same general area of the park, identified as Lisa Connor. Like Taylor, evidence suggested she had been kept alive for months after her abduction. The forensic examination revealed a disturbing pattern. Both women had been meticulously maintained in clean conditions for extended periods, with evidence of regular bathing and medical care. Both had been dressed in preserved versions of their wedding attire at the time of their deaths, though the wedding rings remained missing. The causes of death appeared to be identical: respiratory failure due to prolonged low-level sedation with pharmaceutical-grade medications. The toxicology reports completed by Dr. Vivian Mercer of the State Medical Examiner's Office identified a complex cocktail of sedatives and tranquilizers that had been administered over extended periods. The precision of these dosages suggests someone with significant pharmaceutical knowledge, she testified. The perpetrator maintained these women in a semi-conscious state for months, carefully balancing the medications to prevent both complete consciousness and fatal overdose. This level of control would require not just access to these controlled substances, but expertise in their interaction and administration. This finding narrowed the suspect profile to include individuals with medical or pharmaceutical training, prompting investigators to cross-reference their existing leads against employment records from hospitals, clinics, and pharmacies throughout central Ohio. The discoveries in Hocking Hills triggered a massive search operation throughout the park and surrounding areas. In early May 1987, search teams located a remote cabin accessible only by a narrow, unmarked dirt road. The property records led to a shell corporation that ultimately traced back to Robert Allen Chambers, 42, a former hospital pharmacy technician who had been terminated from Grant Medical Center in Columbus in 1983 for inventory discrepancies involving sedatives and tranquilizers. Subsequent investigation revealed that Chambers had briefly worked in maintenance departments at several central Ohio hotels during the early 1980s before his medical employment. The cabin itself appeared unremarkable from the exterior, a small weathered structure typical of the hunting cabins scattered throughout the region. Property records showed it had been purchased in 1981 through Evergreen Holdings, LLC, a company with a complex ownership structure that required financial investigators weeks to unravel. The connection to Chambers came through a signature on the original purchase documents that matched his handwriting from employment records. A discreet surveillance operation began immediately, with plainclothes officers observing the property from concealed positions in the surrounding forest. Over a 72-hour period, they documented Chambers making 2 visits to the seemingly unoccupied cabin, each time carrying supplies consistent with medical care and basic provisions. His vehicle, a faded blue 1982 Chevrolet Caprice, matched the description and distinctive rust pattern identified from hotel security footage. Surveillance of Chambers revealed he drove a 1982 Chevrolet Caprice with the distinctive rust pattern identified in security footage. When investigators observed him meticulously cleaning the vehicle's interior with professional-grade disinfectants, they obtained a search warrant for both the vehicle and his primary residence in suburban Columbus. The vehicle search revealed trace evidence connecting it to all 4 victims, including microscopic fabric transfers from their wedding attire. More disturbingly, a hidden compartment in the trunk contained sedatives, medical restraints, and a collection of wedding photographs clipped from newspaper announcements, with certain brides circled in red ink. Forensic technicians discovered the hidden compartment behind a modified section of the trunk's interior paneling, accessible through a mechanism disguised as part of the spare tire housing. Inside this space, investigators found a medical kit containing pharmaceutical-grade sedatives, syringes, and IV supplies organized with clinical precision. The restraint systems showed evidence of careful padding to prevent skin damage, consistent with someone intending to hold captives for extended periods without causing visible injury. The wedding announcements had been meticulously preserved in plastic sleeves, each annotated with handwritten notes assessing the bride's appearance, ceremony details, and accommodation information. Victim selection criteria became apparent. Chambers had specifically targeted traditional church weddings with formal attire and receptions at upscale hotels, focusing on brides whose announcements emphasized their happiness and the ceremonial aspects of their weddings. The search of Chambers' home yielded more significant evidence, including a hidden room accessed through a false panel in the basement. Inside, investigators discovered a disturbing shrine containing 4 wedding rings mounted on velvet-covered pedestals, each labeled with the victim's name and wedding date. Photographs taken at the weddings, clearly shot from a distance, covered one wall, showing each bride during her ceremony and reception. A journal detailed Chambers' obsessive thoughts, revealing a delusional belief that he was rescuing the women from marriages he deemed unworthy or impure. The hidden room had been professionally constructed, with soundproofed walls, specialized ventilation, and a dehumidification system designed to preserve the wedding artifacts displayed within. The journal entries dated back to 1980, charting the evolution of Chambers' fixation from distant admiration of bridal beauty to an elaborate delusion of divine purpose. They transform on their wedding day, read one entry from 1982, ascending to a state of grace that should be preserved, not surrendered to mundane existence. These husbands cannot possibly maintain that sacred state. They see only the woman, not the bride. I alone understand what must be protected. Later entries became increasingly specific, detailing his selection criteria and methodologies for what he termed preservation interventions. The clinical language employed throughout suggested an attempt to rationalize his actions within a pseudo-medical framework, a distortion of his pharmaceutical training applied to his delusional mission. Most critically, the search led to a hidden trapdoor in the basement floor, concealing a narrow staircase that descended to a carefully constructed underground room. This space contained 2 occupants, Catherine Reynolds and Jennifer Morris, both alive but heavily sedated. The women had been kept in a controlled environment designed for long-term captivity, with medical equipment monitoring their vital signs and administering regular doses of sedatives. Like the deceased victims, they were dressed in preserved wedding attire, their hair and makeup maintained to match their appearance on their wedding days. The underground chamber represented an elaborate expansion of the cabin's original root cellar, professionally reinforced with concrete walls and equipped with hospital-grade life support systems. HVAC specialist Marcus Donaldson, brought in to analyze the setup, estimated that constructing such a facility would have required months of work and specialized knowledge of medical environment controls. The ventilation system was designed to hospital standards, with regulated temperature, humidity, and air exchange rates. The electrical work included backup generators and uninterruptible power supplies for the medical equipment. This wasn't improvised. It was planned and executed with the precision of a medical facility construction project. This level of preparation indicated that Chambers had been developing his plan for years before acting on it, steadily acquiring the skills and materials needed to create his disturbing preservation chamber. Robert Chambers was arrested on May 12, 1987, and charged with multiple counts of kidnapping, false imprisonment, and 2 counts of first-degree murder. The surviving victims were immediately transported to Ohio State University Medical Center, where they began the long process of physical and psychological recovery. Their testimony would eventually provide crucial insights into Chambers' methodology and the horrific experiences they endured during their captivity. Dr. Samantha Richardson, the neurologist who supervised the medical treatment of Reynolds and Morris, documented the complex challenges of their recovery. Both women had been maintained in a semi-sedated state for months, receiving carefully calibrated doses of multiple sedatives through automated IV systems. The pharmaceutical regimen had been designed to keep them conscious enough to maintain basic biological functions, but sufficiently sedated to prevent resistance or clear memory formation. This resulted in a form of chemically induced dissociative state that presented significant challenges for both physical and psychological recovery. The women exhibited muscle atrophy from prolonged immobility, nutritional deficiencies, despite evidence of regular feeding, and complex psychological trauma characterized by fragmented memories and temporal disorientation. The subsequent investigation revealed Chambers had developed an obsessive fixation on brides following the dissolution of his own engagement in 1983, when his fiancée abruptly ended their relationship 3 weeks before their wedding. Colleagues from Grant Medical Center described a marked personality change after this event, noting increasing isolation and unusual interest in wedding announcements in local papers. Employment records showed he had worked briefly at each of the hotels where the abductions occurred, providing him with knowledge of security protocols and service access points. Linda Woodward, who had been engaged to Chambers before breaking off their relationship, provided investigators with crucial context for understanding the origins of his fixation. "Robert became obsessed with the details of our wedding planning," she explained. "What started as normal enthusiasm became something different. He was less interested in our future together than in the ceremony itself. He kept adding more traditional elements, more elaborate rituals. When I suggested simplifying, he became disturbingly angry, insisting that the sacred transition required specific observances. This fixation on ceremonial aspects, rather than the relationship itself, aligned with the ritualistic elements observed in his crimes, suggesting that his broken engagement had catalyzed rather than created his disturbing obsession with bridal preservation. Detective Harrington's methodical review of Chambers' employment history revealed a concerning pattern that had previously gone unnoticed. Before working at Grant Medical Center, Chambers had cycled through positions at various hotels across Ohio, rarely staying more than 6 months at any location. Exit interviews consistently cited seeking better opportunities as his reason for departure, but former supervisors noted his unusual interest in wedding events and honeymoon suite protocols. One manager at the Columbus Marriott recalled reprimanding Chambers for entering a honeymoon suite unannounced during his maintenance shift, an incident he had explained away as a miscommunication regarding room status. This pattern of employment migration created a perfect background for his crimes. He gained intimate knowledge of each hotel's layout, security systems, and operational procedures without remaining long enough to be memorable to staff. Human resources records showed he had worked at the Columbus Marriott for 4 months in early 1984, the Renaissance Cleveland for 3 months in late 1984, and the Cincinnati Hilton for 5 months in early 1985, each position preceding the corresponding abduction by approximately 3 months. This timeline suggested he used his employment periods to study potential targets and plan his approaches, then executed the abductions after leaving the positions to minimize the risk of recognition. The detailed notebooks recovered from Chambers' residence provided investigators with disturbing insights into his selection process. He had developed an elaborate rating system for potential victims, assigning numerical values to various attributes: dress style, religious elements in the ceremony, perceived happiness of the couple, and even the weather on their wedding day. Entries dated as far back as 1980 demonstrated a gradual evolution of his fixation, beginning with distant admiration and eventually developing into detailed abduction scenarios. The earliest plans were clearly fantastical, but entries from late 1983 onward showed increasing practicality and operational focus, coinciding with his professional experience in both hotel operations and pharmaceutical access. The rating system, termed Bridal Preservation Assessment in his notebooks, assigned values from 1 to 10 across multiple categories. Highest scores went to traditional church ceremonies with formal attire, particularly those featuring cathedral-length veils and classic A-line dresses. He documented weather conditions at each ceremony, with clear sunny days receiving higher scores, what he termed divine blessing in his notes. The grooms were evaluated negatively, with demerits assigned for any perceived unworthiness, including minor behavioral details like laughed during solemn moment or handled veil carelessly. These assessments culminated in a total score that determined whether the bride would be selected for preservation, a euphemism for abduction and captivity. All 4 victims had scored above 90 on his 100-point scale, with dozens of other brides documented but assigned insufficient scores for action. Forensic psychologists who examined the notebooks identified a critical escalation point following Chambers' termination from Grant Medical Center. His writings shifted from hypothetical scenarios to concrete planning, including detailed diagrams of hotel layouts, security patrol schedules, and methods for accessing restricted areas. He had meticulously researched each bride through public records and social media, creating comprehensive profiles that included their education, family connections, and even medical histories when available. This level of preparation explained how he could target victims with such precision and confidence. Dr. Elizabeth Gardner, the lead forensic psychologist assigned to profile Chambers, identified his condition as a rare combination of erotomania and persecutory delusional disorder. Unlike typical erotomanic delusions where the subject believes a specific person loves them, Chambers developed a more abstract fixation on the concept of bridal purity rather than specific women, she explained. He believed these women had achieved a sacred state during their wedding ceremonies that would inevitably be corrupted by their marriages. In his delusional framework, he wasn't harming them, but preserving them in their most perfect form. This psychological assessment helped explain the unusual pattern of extended captivity rather than immediate violence. Chambers' primary goal was not the act of abduction itself, but the long-term maintenance of what he perceived as a sacred state. The investigation of Chambers' background revealed additional concerning incidents that had never been formally connected. Between 1980 and 1983, 3 Ohio hotels reported unusual disturbances involving honeymoon suites, including a 1982 case where a bride reported awakening to find a maintenance worker standing in her room, who quickly departed claiming to have entered the wrong room. The incident had been dismissed as an honest mistake, but retrospective analysis suggested it may have been an early aborted attempt by Chambers to refine his methodology. Cold case investigators subsequently re-examined these reports, interviewing the women involved and connecting these incidents to Chambers' developing pattern. Janice Wheeler, the bride from the 1982 incident, provided a description that closely matched Chambers' appearance at that time. "I woke up and saw someone in maintenance clothes standing by the bed, just watching me," she recalled. "When I startled, he apologized and backed out, saying he had the wrong room. I reported it but didn't think much more about it. These things happen in hotels." The timing and circumstances aligned with Chambers' employment records and geographical movements, suggesting a progression from observation to actual room entry before he developed his more sophisticated abduction techniques. The timeline reconstructed by investigators suggested that Chambers had spent nearly a year preparing for his first successful abduction. Hotel employment records showed he had worked briefly at the Columbus Marriott 6 months before Rebecca Taylor's disappearance, using his position to study security protocols and access points. Similar patterns emerged with the other hotels, always securing temporary employment that provided knowledge of the facilities without establishing a memorable presence. This methodical preparation underscored the calculated nature of his crimes and helped explain how he had evaded detection for so long. The cabin in Hocking Hills, purchased through a complex series of shell corporations, had been acquired 3 years before the first abduction. Records indicated Chambers had made significant modifications to the property, including reinforcing the basement with concrete and installing a sophisticated ventilation system. The electrical work had been professionally done, though no licensed contractor could be identified. Investigators concluded that Chambers likely performed the work himself, utilizing skills he had developed during his various maintenance positions. The remote location, accessible only by an unmarked dirt road and invisible from any main thoroughfare, provided the perfect isolation for his activities. Construction supply purchases tracked through financial records showed that Chambers had acquired materials gradually over a 2-year period, careful never to make suspiciously large purchases from any single supplier. Former neighbors from his previous residence recalled seeing him load construction materials into his caprice on weekends, mentioning plans for a hunting cabin renovation when casually questioned. Ohio Electric Cooperative records showed a significant increase in power consumption at the property beginning in 1984, consistent with the operation of medical equipment and environmental control systems. These details painted a picture of methodical, long-term preparation that explained how he had created such a sophisticated captivity environment without attracting attention. The trial of Robert Chambers began on March 7, 1988, in the Franklin County Courthouse in Columbus. The proceedings attracted national media attention, with the press dubbing Chambers the wedding photographer, due to his extensive surveillance and documentation of his victims' ceremonies. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Eleanor Simmons, presented overwhelming physical evidence connecting Chambers to all 4 victims. Forensic experts testified about the sophisticated medical system he had constructed to keep his captives sedated but alive, utilizing his pharmaceutical knowledge to maintain precise dosages that prevented overdoses. The courtroom had been specially prepared for this high-profile case, with enhanced security and arrangements for the extensive evidence presentation. The prosecution's opening statement established their narrative. Chambers had systematically targeted, stalked, and abducted brides on their wedding nights, keeping them in captivity for extended periods, while maintaining a delusional belief that he was preserving their bridal state. Assistant District Attorney Marcus Thompson methodically laid out the chronology of the crimes, connecting each abduction to Chambers' employment history, vehicle sightings, and evidence recovered from both his home and the cabin. The defense, led by court-appointed attorney Richard Donovan, faced the challenging task of addressing overwhelming physical evidence while pursuing an insanity defense based on Chambers' clearly documented delusions. The testimony of Catherine Reynolds and Jennifer Morris proved particularly powerful. Despite having been heavily sedated throughout their captivity, both women recalled periods of semi-consciousness during which Chambers would speak to them as though they were willing participants in elaborate role plays, referring to himself as their true husband and describing their captivity as an eternal honeymoon. He would meticulously recreate wedding scenes, positioning them in their preserved dresses while playing recorded wedding music. The psychological evaluation of Chambers revealed a delusional disorder fixated on the purity and sanctity of marriage, with a belief that he was saving these women from what he perceived as unworthy partners. Catherine Reynolds testified from behind a privacy screen, her voice steady despite the trauma she described. There were moments of clarity between the sedative doses, she explained. He would come down to the underground room wearing a tuxedo, carrying flowers. He would arrange my wedding dress and veil, position me in specific poses, and recite what sounded like wedding vows. He never seemed to recognize that I wasn't participating willingly. In his mind, we were engaged in some kind of eternal wedding ceremony that needed to be constantly renewed. Jennifer Morris's testimony corroborated this pattern, adding that Chambers kept detailed records of what he called preservation sessions, maintaining a clinical log of sedative administrations alongside romantic descriptions of these disturbing ritual reenactments. The defense attempted to pursue an insanity plea, but psychiatric evaluations determined that despite his delusional beliefs, Chambers understood the nature and wrongfulness of his actions. His methodical planning, efforts to conceal evidence, and elaborate precautions to avoid detection demonstrated clear awareness of his criminal conduct. The defense's position collapsed when prosecutors presented journal entries detailing Chambers' deliberate selection process and calculated abduction strategies, including his use of the Chevrolet Caprice specifically because it resembled vehicles used by hotel security and law enforcement. Dr. Howard Kessler, the court-appointed psychiatric expert, testified that Chambers represented a complex case of delusional disorder with preserved reality testing. The defendant maintained two parallel mental frameworks, Dr. Kessler explained. Within his delusional system, he believed he was performing a sacred duty to preserve these women in their bridal state. Yet simultaneously, he demonstrated clear awareness that society would view his actions as criminal, hence his elaborate measures to avoid detection and conceal evidence. This awareness of wrongfulness, despite his delusions, means he cannot meet the legal standard for insanity under Ohio law. This testimony effectively undermined the defense's primary strategy, leaving them with little to counter the overwhelming physical evidence and victim testimony. In one particularly damning journal entry, dated January 1984, Chambers had written, "The caprice is perfect, anonymous, yet authoritative. Hotel staff barely glance at maintenance uniforms, and the vehicle suggests legitimacy. No one questions a familiar car in a service area." This level of self-aware calculation directly contradicted the defense's claim that he had been operating under uncontrollable delusions without understanding the criminality of his actions. The courtroom fell silent when prosecutors presented evidence from Chambers' carefully organized filing system. Each victim had a dedicated folder containing newspaper wedding announcements, surveillance photographs, and handwritten notes about their ceremonies, receptions, and personal details. Most disturbing were the acquisition plans, detailed step-by-step procedures for each abduction, including contingency measures for various scenarios. These documents demonstrated a level of premeditation that shocked even seasoned criminologists observing the trial. Testimony from former colleagues at Grant Medical Center revealed that Chambers had systematically pilfered pharmaceuticals for years before his termination, focusing on sedatives that could be administered without causing immediate unconsciousness. His expertise in pharmaceutical dosing explained how he had been able to subdue his victims without violence or commotion, a critical factor in his ability to remove them from hotel rooms without alerting their spouses or hotel security. The prosecution demonstrated that this methodology had been refined over time, with each abduction becoming more efficient than the last. The trial also revealed the elaborate measures Chambers had taken to monitor potential victims long before their weddings. Records showed he had subscribed to multiple local newspapers across Ohio, specifically to track engagement and wedding announcements. He maintained detailed schedules of wedding venues and reception locations throughout the state, often traveling hundreds of miles to observe ceremonies from a distance. Surveillance equipment found in his home included high-powered telephoto lenses and directional microphones, allowing him to photograph and record wedding ceremonies from parking lots or adjacent buildings without detection. After just 6 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with unanimous guilty verdicts on all counts. On April 22, 1988, Judge William T. Marshall sentenced Robert Allen Chambers to death by electric chair, stating that his crimes represented the most elaborate and disturbing predatory behavior this court has ever encountered. The sentence was met with approval from victims' families and a public that had been terrorized by the mysterious disappearances for nearly 4 years. During the sentencing phase, Judge Marshall took the unusual step of directly addressing Chambers' distorted perception of his crimes. "You have repeatedly described your actions as acts of rescue and preservation," Marshall stated. "But what you truly destroyed was far more sacred than what you claimed to protect. You violated not just the bodily autonomy of these women, but the very covenant of trust and safety that marriage represents. Your obsession with preserving a moment has robbed families of lifetimes of potential memories." The aftermath of the trial brought a series of civil lawsuits against the hotels involved, alleging negligent security practices and inadequate background checking procedures. These cases ultimately led to industry-wide reforms in hotel security protocols, particularly regarding access to honeymoon suites and wedding accommodations. The Renaissance Hotels chain implemented a wedding security package that became standard across their properties, including dedicated staff monitoring for wedding guests and enhanced key card security for newlyweds' rooms. The hotel industry's response extended beyond the specific chains involved in the Chambers case. The American Hotel and Lodging Association developed new security guidelines specifically addressing honeymoon suite protection, staff identification verification, and maintenance access protocols. These guidelines, published in 1990 as Special Accommodation Security Protocols, became industry standard throughout North America. Key innovations included specialized keycards for honeymoon suites that required additional verification for staff access, dedicated security personnel for wedding events, and enhanced background checks for employees with access to guest accommodations. Many hotels also implemented policies requiring maintenance personnel to work in pairs when accessing occupied rooms, a simple procedural change that might have prevented Chambers' methodology from succeeding. The Grant Medical Center faced particular scrutiny for their handling of Chambers' termination. While they had documented his inventory discrepancies and dismissed him accordingly, they had failed to report these discrepancies to law enforcement or professional licensing boards, allowing him to maintain access to pharmaceuticals through secondary means. This oversight led to new regulations requiring healthcare facilities to report all cases of suspected pharmaceutical theft to both law enforcement and industry oversight organizations. The medical community's response extended beyond reporting requirements to include enhanced security measures for pharmaceutical storage and tracking. The Ohio Board of Pharmacy implemented new guidelines for monitoring controlled substances, with particular attention to the sedatives and tranquilizers Chambers had utilized. These regulations required electronic tracking of dispensation, regular inventory reconciliation, and biometric access controls for storage areas. Additionally, healthcare facilities instituted more rigorous background checking procedures for pharmacy technicians and others with medication access, creating a model that would eventually be adopted nationwide. These changes represented a significant legacy of the case. Systematic improvements in pharmaceutical security that likely prevented countless potential medication thefts and diversions in the decades that followed. Robert Chambers was transported to Ohio's Lucasville death row facility, where he remained through a series of appeals that delayed his execution. During this time, he granted a single television interview to criminologist Dr. Emily Richards, providing insights into his distorted thinking. "They were perfect on their wedding days," he explained with unsettling calmness. "I wanted to preserve that perfection, that moment when they were truly brides. The world corrupts that purity. I was protecting them from what would come next." When asked about the wedding rings, he became agitated, insisting they were symbols of false promises that he had liberated from the women. This rare interview revealed additional aspects of Chambers' psychology that hadn't emerged during the trial. He spoke at length about his childhood in rural Ohio, describing how he had become fascinated with wedding ceremonies after serving as a ring bearer at his cousin's wedding at age 8. "Everyone was so focused on the bride," he recalled. "She was transformed that day, elevated to something beyond ordinary. I wanted to understand that transformation, to preserve it somehow." This early fixation had apparently developed over decades into his distorted belief system about bridal purity and his self-appointed role as its guardian. When Dr. Richards pressed him about the harm he had caused, Chambers displayed the compartmentalization that had allowed him to maintain his delusion. "I never hurt them," he insisted, despite the evidence to the contrary. "The ones who died, that was a mistake in the medication. I was trying to keep them in that perfect state, suspended in time. The real violence would have been letting them descend into ordinary life, losing that bridal glow." This disconnect between his actions and their consequences reinforced the psychiatric assessment that his delusions, while profound, did not prevent him from understanding the wrongfulness of his conduct. Throughout his incarceration, Chambers received numerous letters from true crime enthusiasts and individuals fascinated by his case. Prison officials noted his methodical organization of this correspondence, similar to the filing systems he had maintained for his victims. He responded selectively, primarily to academic researchers studying criminal psychology, seemingly eager to explain his philosophy regarding bridal purity. These letters later became the subject of ethical debates among criminologists about the responsibility of researchers when corresponding with convicted killers. On November 17, 1997, after his final appeal was rejected by the Supreme Court, Robert Allen Chambers was executed by electric chair at the Southern Ohio Correctional Facility in Lucasville. He offered no final statement and declined his last meal. Witnesses reported that he appeared calm and resigned as the procedure was carried out. Among those present were Michael Taylor and Thomas Connor, the widowers of his first two victims, and Detective James Harrington, who had dedicated years to solving the case. Catherine Reynolds and Jennifer Morris did not attend, having chosen to move forward with their lives rather than confront their captor one final time. The case prompted significant changes in Ohio's hotel security protocols and privacy practices regarding wedding announcements. Many newspapers discontinued publishing specific details about upcoming ceremonies, and hotels implemented new security measures for honeymoon suites, including dedicated staff to monitor wedding night accommodations. The Ohio State Highway Patrol established new training protocols for recognizing patterns in seemingly unrelated cases across jurisdictional boundaries, with Detective Harrington's methodical approach becoming a model for cross-departmental cooperation. For the survivors, recovery was a long and challenging journey. Catherine Reynolds eventually remarried in a private ceremony in 1992, choosing to reclaim the ritual that had been so horrifically distorted in her experience. Jennifer Morris became an advocate for victims of trauma, establishing a foundation that provides psychological support for survivors of kidnapping and captivity. Both women maintained contact with the families of Rebecca Taylor and Lisa Connor, creating a support network bonded by their shared connection to a tragedy that had altered each of their lives profoundly. The faded blue Chevrolet Caprice that had once idled outside churches and hotels across Ohio became an exhibit in the Ohio State Police Museum, a reminder of both the methodical evil that had stalked the state's brides and the determined investigation that had ultimately brought that evil to justice. Beside it stands a display detailing the case and honoring the victims, both those who lost their lives and those who survived to reclaim them. A small plaque bears the words of Detective Harrington upon Chambers' conviction. The wedding day represents our highest hopes for happiness and new beginnings. That such a sacred moment could be twisted into an instrument of terror reminds us of our responsibility to protect joy as fiercely as we pursue justice. In the decades that followed, the case of the Ohio wedding night killer became a landmark study in forensic psychology, particularly regarding fixation disorders and ritualistic criminal behavior. Criminologists noted the unusual aspect of Chambers' efforts to preserve his victims in a suspended state, rather than immediately harming them, suggesting a complex psychological need to maintain them in their bridal state indefinitely. This aspect distinguished the case from more typical predatory behavior and complicated the psychiatric analysis of his motivations. Dr. Marvin Kellerman, a leading forensic psychiatrist who extensively studied the case files, published an influential analysis in the Journal of Criminal Psychology in 2001. Chambers represents a unique category of ritualistic offender, he wrote. Unlike most predators who seek immediate gratification through violence or sexual assault, his pathology centered on the symbolic preservation of a moment, specifically the transition from unmarried to married woman. This suspended animation fantasy explains the elaborate medical systems designed to maintain his victims in a state of semi-consciousness rather than simply killing them immediately. This analysis has informed approaches to similar fixation disorders and helped establish new diagnostic criteria for what Kellerman termed ceremonial preservation psychosis. The methodical nature of Chambers' planning and execution also reshaped how law enforcement approached pattern recognition across jurisdictional boundaries. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit incorporated the case into their training materials, highlighting how apparently unrelated incidents separated by geography and time can actually represent a single perpetrator's evolving methodology. Special Agent Nathan Bradley, who developed these materials, emphasized the importance of establishing centralized reporting systems for unusual crimes. Before digital databases, cases like the wedding night vanishings required extraordinary effort to connect. Detective Harrington essentially created a manual database through persistent communication with departments across the state. Today's systems automate this process, but the fundamental investigative principle remains the same. Always question whether seemingly isolated incidents might share underlying patterns. The discovery that Chambers had maintained an elaborate photo album of Ohio weddings dating back to 1980 suggested he had been fantasizing and planning his crimes for years before acting on his impulses. Investigators found evidence that he had attended dozens of wedding ceremonies as an unnoticed observer, sometimes posing as distant family or a venue staff member, carefully evaluating potential victims based on criteria outlined in his journals. This long period of fantasy and observation before commission aligned with emerging theories about the escalation patterns in certain types of serial predators. Analysis of Chambers' wedding attendance revealed a gradual narrowing of his focus over time. Early observations included weddings of various types and settings, but by 1982, he had begun exclusively targeting traditional church ceremonies with specific ritualistic elements. His journals indicated particular fixation on brides who displayed what he termed authentic ceremonial reverence, those who seemed most emotionally invested in the traditional aspects of the wedding ceremony. This pattern provided valuable insights for profilers studying the development of ritualistic criminal behavior, demonstrating how general fascination can evolve into specific, actionable criteria for victim selection. For the communities across Ohio that had lived in fear during the investigation, the resolution brought relief, but also lasting caution. Wedding traditions in the region subtly adapted. Many couples began keeping their wedding plans private, venues enhanced security protocols, and the previously common newspaper announcements became increasingly rare or deliberately vague. Hotels throughout the Midwest developed specific security measures for newlyweds, implementing room checks and dedicated staff for wedding parties that continue in some establishments to this day. The case also prompted academic research into the cultural significance of wedding rituals and their potential to attract dangerous fixations. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a cultural anthropologist at Ohio State University, conducted a comprehensive study examining how public displays of transitional life moments might create vulnerabilities. Weddings represent one of the few remaining public rituals where private individuals temporarily enter a very public spotlight, she noted in her 1999 publication. This visibility, while culturally significant and emotionally important, creates a unique vulnerability that most participants haven't historically considered. The Chambers case forced a societal recalibration of the balance between celebration and security. This narrative is based on archives and historical reports. Some names have been altered. We seek to understand, not sensationalize. The outcome corresponds to public records of conviction. No graphic violence was described.